Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Illinois at Chicago. I am Teresa Cordova, Director of the Great Cities Institute. We are the sponsors of this event, along with the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. I want to thank the Great Cities Institute staff and send a big shout out to Christiana, who wishes she could be here. Thank you also to the staff here at Student Center East, all of you, who helped us out and without whom this event would not be possible. We thank CAN TV, our friends at CAN TV, our local community access. Thank you to the readers of the Chicago Reader. In the Reader's Best of Chicago edition, we received runner-up for Best Lecture Series in Chicago. And of course, we are extremely honored by that. Today, we welcome our dear friend, the Great Cities Institute James J. Stuckel Senior Fellow, Professor John Hagedorn. Yay. Over the last few days, as I have been preparing my introduction for John, I've been looking at his books again, watching videos of the events that we've held with him, and I was wondering, how could I possibly compact in a few words an introduction that could cover the breadth and significance of John's work and convey the greatness of this magnificent man, researcher, and teacher. So I was going for a walk yesterday evening. We've had some nice weather here in Chicago. And I remembered that seeing that Lalo Valdez, a drug and alcohol researcher at the University of Southern California, had registered for this event. I needed to talk to him about something else, so I called him. I gave him a call, and he said, "Hey, where are you? What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm out walking, and as soon as I get home, I have to finish my introduction for John." I said, "What am I going to say? There's so much to say about John." He said, "Well, when I knew John many years ago, I knew him as a badass organizer in Milwaukee." So I said, "Lalo, thanks. You just gave me my introduction. All I need to do is say that John is a badass ethnographer." Right? That says it all. And that we are grateful that he brought his fervor to academia and the world of research and teaching. John represents the best of let me start again. This is a good line. John represents the best of ethnography and helps keep it elevated as one of our most significant and useful methodological tools to gain a deep understanding of what is happening, and especially what is happening on the ground. John's qualities as a gracious, caring human being carry over into his ethnographic skills. It takes a certain kind of person to do good ethnography. It takes a willingness to build relationships and to understand people from their points of view, while simultaneously building an analytical framework that considers context, structural factors, and dynamics of social and personal interactions. His focus on economic restructuring and the plight of communities devastated by deindustrialization still, unfortunately, rings true. In 1998, referring to the devastating impacts of economic restructuring, John said in the second edition of People and Folks that, quote, "History will judge current American policy harshly, and that left to our current course, we are sure to witness desperate acts of violence and rebellion." And here we are, witnessing both the failure of urban and economic policies along with desperate acts of violence and rebellion. And here John is, decades later, still engaged in the struggle to point policymakers in the direction of creating opportunities and rebuilding communities, and against scapegoating and demonizing individuals in gangs. The focus, he argues, is on building stability and hope. John has brought his fervor and sensitivity to the courtroom, where he spent countless hours defending men and women against stereotypes, He saw firsthand the tragic impacts of the demonization and has shared with us some of what he witnessed when gangs are on trial. Congratulations on your book, John, and thank you for being willing to spend this time with us. May I present Professor John Hagedorn.
Oh, I don't quite know how to follow up that introduction. And I, had a list of going to recognize a bunch of people here, but it's sort of like my wife said, it's like an Academy Awards thing, and you thank all these people, and everyone's bored before you get done. But I would like to recognize Randolph Stone here from University of Chicago, who I worked 2 cases in chapter 9, whatever it is, the one on I'm Not a Hired Gun, or juvenile life without parole cases. And Randolph exemplifies not just the highly skilled lawyers that I work with, but a lawyer that's committed to supporting the humanity of the defendants, the people he represented. And that's, while I pitched in these cases, it's really the lawyers that really led the fight and that are under attack. The Judge Jackson is being nominated, but she's being attacked not only for being a Black woman, but she was a public defender, and she stood up for the evidence being used to convict rather than stereotypes or the belief that this person is evil in himself. So it's a major fight around the future of justice to see what happens to that nomination. I'm certainly grateful to Teresa and Beth from Great Cities and CLJ for sponsoring this, and Matthew and Lisa for building it. And I also want to shout out to Christiana Kinder, who Chris is the heart and soul of Great Cities. And what Eli Anderson has this phrase about white spaces and black spaces. And often when you bring people from the community into the university, it's like an alien thing. It's like they're nervous, whatever. And when he came to Great Cities, Chris was there to greet them, and she's a daughter of North Lawndale. So all the guys from North Lawndale, they knew her and they really felt at home. And I don't know if you'd say that Great Cities was a black space, but it certainly wasn't a white space, and a place that was comfortable for all the people I brought in from the streets to have meetings. And there was a reason why I did all my meetings at Great Cities. So Chris, I'm sorry you can't be here. I love you, and I hope to see you soon. So the course that I ran here, Gangs in the Media, that many of you may have been part of or known, really played a major role in writing this book. I said that the students who took that course, there's only 3 things they were going to learn, right? Gangs are not one thing. Gang members have, like all of us, have multiple conflicting identities. And the media image of gangs differ from what we learned from research. 3 things, real simple. And I repeated those lessons in my work in court. And unlike the students in my class who really a lot of them got A's, because if you only have to learn 3 things, you're really pretty simple to do, right? But in the courts flunked pretty regularly in understanding those things. Maybe a better way to introduce, here we go, Gangs on Trial, and I guess it's at the bookstore, right? Is that what it is? That is sort of to look at American culture. We live in a time when millions of people believe the last presidential election was stolen, despite no evidence of substantial theft or fraud. Or Pizzagate, that high-ranking Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, used a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor as a front for a pedophile child trafficking sex ring. And of course, we can't forget Marjorie Taylor Greene, blaming Jewish space lasers for igniting California wildfires. Now, you can't laugh at that because millions of people believe that stuff, right? Maybe for this audience, a better illustration is critical race theory, the furor around it. Now, I taught critical race theory for 22 years at UIC. You know, Derek Bell's The Space Trader was a regular part of my history of violence class. And I met Derek Bell in the 80s in Milwaukee. He was the keynote speaker to a conference we organized on desegregation, a new form of discrimination, where we were mobilizing the Black community and the broader community to oppose an integration plan that bused only Black kids out of their neighborhoods. It didn't bus any white kids at all, right? But CRT really, when you look at it, is a concept that's tied to demonization and stereotypes. The demonization of teachers who are trying to make their students uncomfortable. I plead guilty to that. The whole point of my gangs in the media class is to make students uncomfortable about their stereotypes about gangs and race, right? But it's also the defense of stereotypes of the great white founding fathers, and that to look at the greatness of our country and just omit the fact that these founding fathers, some of them were slave owners, and many of them were doing everything they can to exterminate the brutish Native American people because they covet their land. Now, not all founders were slaveholders or Indian killers. Stereotypes are not representative of categories, but express a belief in the essential nature of the category. To the anti-CRT crowd, the founding fathers are essentially noble and good in this great American experiment, and let's just forget about those discrepant facts like massacring Indians and owning human beings. Or in my gangs in the media class, when I asked my class to close their eyes and think of a gang member, right? So they all closed their eyes, and then when they opened their eyes, I had projected an image of a white woman doing the dishes on the wall. And of course, they all laughed because the image that they had was of a Black or Latino male with chains and guns and the whole bit. That was their view of the essence, what they thought the essence of a gang member. Of course, I'd ask them, aren't some gang members white? Aren't some women? And do you think that gang members do more dishes or drive-bys, right? You know, so we're not talking about what's typical. We're talking about what people think is the essence of the category. What do they really believe a gang member is? And that's what they envisioned. We live in a world where our social media feeds are filled with stereotypes of those different than us, and allegations of wrongdoing require no evidence. Immigrants, people of color, and particularly Black males, are routinely demonized. Mexican immigrants are called rapists and murderers. You know, that's the essence of the category that Donald Trump put out of what an immigrant is, right? And people hold that despite there being no evidence, and that it's based on a lot of racist assumptions. So welcome to the courtrooms that I describe in Gangs on Trial. It's precisely what goes on. What I found during my 83 gang-related cases, I worked as an expert witness, were prosecutors commonly using crude and absurd stereotypes in place of evidence, and juries believe them. Oh, you think gang trials couldn't possibly be absurd as pedophile sex rings? Consider the story that leads the book of Robert Butts and Marion Wilson. What do you think the impact was on a jury in Bible Belt, Milledgeville, Georgia? Mainly white jury. When Ricky Horn, a Baldwin County sheriff, gang expert, testified that the name of the gang the defendants were members of, Folks, Folks, was actually an acronym for Followers of Our Lord King Satan. Black, male, gang member, convicted of murder, devil worshippers. 5 strikes is enough, right? Now, which is more absurd? Blaming Satan for murder or blaming Hillary Clinton for running a pedophile child sex ring? I'm not sure, but I do know that alternative facts that pollute our politics and social media feeds also pollute our legal system. Now, not all gang trials are as extreme as the Butts and Wilsons, though Gangs on Trial is filled with a bunch of showstoppers. And fortunately, I won't tell you all of them, tell the stories. You're gonna have to read the book to go through them. And it's only 207 pages, and it's filled with stories, and it's easy to read, and the proceeds go to a good cause. All royalties go to the Georgia Research Center, give free, high-quality legal representation to death row inmates in Georgia. What I encountered throughout my trials was a stereotype that really was persistent here. A police gang expert will come in and testify that the motive for a crime, especially murder, was to advance the defendant's status in the gang. Okay, it's accepted by judges and juries since it's testimony from a police gang expert and it fits with common stereotypes of gangs. Of course, crimes by gang members are committed for many reasons, but prosecutors downplay emotional conflicts, disputes over money, jealousy over a woman, getting carried away in a fit of anger, getting money as a motive for robbery, in favor of insisting the crime was motivated by a desire for higher gang status. It's all about gangs, Jackie Montanez's prosecutors told the jury of her killing 2 Latin kings. And unmentioned was her rape starting at age 9, and sexual abuse by a Latin king's stepfather. Do you think maybe that had something to do with her actions? Well, it wasn't allowed to be presented within the court. The only thing was allowed to be presented as motive was her gang, her gang motivation for killing. To portray her as a damaged, sexually abused young girl would have, really was what they didn't want to do, because that might allow the jury to have some empathy, to see who Jackie is as someone that could have been me, right? And so the trick of stereotypes and demonization is that the prosecutors look at a gang member and say, he's different than us, right? We're the people here, and gang members are a different kind of creature. For example, in the thing about gaining status in the gang, it's seldom brought out that there's many ways to achieve status in the gang, if that's what you're about, and that violence often is a sign of low status. It's people who are disposable, right? They're going to go commit the crimes and go to prison, and the chiefs can, sit back and get high, right? But that's not part of the deal, because you want to look at this gang member as something else, and that there's no way to identify human feelings and emotions because he really isn't human. Jackie Montanez was was called the teen queen of criminals. And 15-year-old Jackie was said to be worse than Al Capone, really. Prosecutors routinely imply gang members are another species entirely than us. If they're not doing the bidding of Satan, they're killing to get higher rank in an evil empire. Facts don't really matter. The point is, prosecutors argue gang members are not like normal people, flawed people like you and me, who emotionally act in ways that may be wrong, but understandable. 15-year-old Jackie Martinez was captured on camera throwing her forks down, a gang sign saying "King Killer," right? And of course that was used as evidence of what an unfeeling monster she was. You know, Jackie herself, you talked to her, said, you know, that she wasn't a big bad wolf, but more of a puppy dog, that she was scared out of her mind. Well, then why would she do such a thing? Well, those from criminology here know about the concept of neutralization. You do something that violates your deepest prohibitions, right? You need to have an excuse to yourself of why you did that. And when you did something like killing someone, can you imagine? Just think, if you kill somebody, what your response would be? You know, you want to protect yourself because you did something so awful. You know, so you come up with justifications, these neutralizations, in order to stop the hurt from coming. And I saw that again and again in murders. People say outrageous things afterwards, and they're really covering up the hurt and the pain. You know, Jackie was, you know, covering up the sort of an hysterical. You talk to her, and I've known her. She's about to be released, so this is, you know, she's been in jail since 1992 when she was 15. So she's excited about getting out. But her state was just a hysterical state of, what did I do? You know, some people who were killed, and she's facing was possibly the death penalty. She was, 6 days short of her 16th birthday, and prosecutors said, because of those 6 days, unfortunately, we can't give you the death penalty. So that's why she's alive today, and sort of the lawyers at Northwestern were able to you know, in the resentencing hearings, the juvenile life without parole that I did with several cases with Randolph, able to get her to down to a 63-year sentence, which is up next year. Throughout the cases that I had, you know, the defendants were treated as something else. Ike Easley, you know, whose story I tell in chapter 9, you know, they said, stop him before he kills again, right? So the correctional officials were testifying because he had killed a correctional official that he needed to be put to death. Roderick Harris was called unstoppable evil. Well, what do you do with unstoppable evil? You can't do anything, so you put it to death, right? You know, or you lock it up forever, throw away the key, or Thomas Demetrius Smith was called Mad Dog, not just by prosecutors, but in the court documents. They referred to him not just by his name, Thomas Demetrius Smith, but Thomas Mad Dog Smith. That's what all the court documents read. And all the hit newspaper headlines, Mad Dog does this, Mad Dog was that. What do you do with a mad dog, right? You put it down, right? So the use of language, the use of dehumanization is a way for prosecutors to be able to get the harshest sentences, including the death penalty. So what I want to do briefly here for a couple of minutes is outline the argument of the book, because the book is is stories. It's the heart of it is all these stories, but there's a method to my madness of these stories. And, this is the basic argument. First, we all think in stereotypes. Not just them, us too, right? Humans naturally categorize people in groups and tend to treat all members of the group the same. That saves a cognitive shortcut, that saves us time and energy. Social psychologist Gordon Allport said in 1954, a person with dark brown skin will activate whatever concept of Negro is dominant in our mind. Neuroscientists tell us while our conscious mind processes up to 40 pieces of information a second, subconsciously, we can process 11 million pieces of information per second. Let's take that in for a second. In other words, all sorts of stuff is going on subconsciously in our minds. And the popular description of that is Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, right? He lays this out. And so the negative associations we have about gangs are all there and are available and influence what we're thinking without us ever being conscious of it. So what is our stereotype of gangs? In the gangs and media class, I asked students to free associate gangs, and I got a torrent of drive-bys, drug deals, gangster rap, violence, right? Nary an association. Nobody said human being, right? Which I would present, and so they would stop and what's going on. In Gangs on Trial, I cite Roget's thesaurus synonyms for gang member. I'll read a few. Bad person, antichrist, evildoer, black sheep, scum, and women don't get off, wanton, hussy, loose woman, and white people don't get off either, white trash. In fact, I suspect Roget was sitting in on my gangs and media class and taking notes from the comments of my students. Those are the words that are used that accompany the image in your mind when you think about a gang member. When our stereotype of gangs is an individual gang member, before a jury, compared to our stereotype, this prototype, the picture in our head, shades and shapes the evidence of the actual defendant. We know lots about him from the stereotype. We don't need the evidence to tell us who this guy is. The stereotype tells us who this guy is, right? So, and it's effortlessly, it's unconsciously, that's what goes on when you look at a gang member on trial. They look at him and they see one thing, and really what's in their mind is this jeweled, armed, evil, scary guy, right? It's a magic. Stereotypes are magic. You can look at something and not see it, and see something else. That's what I've been fighting in court for for so many years. But can't we keep an open mind? Jurors are told to keep an open mind. Let me quote Gordon Allport. Here's what I wrote in Gangs on Trial. Open-mindedness is considered to be a virtue, Allport says, with startling implications for criminal trials. But strictly speaking, it cannot occur. A new experience must be redacted into old categories. We cannot handle each event freshly in its own right. Big problems for innocent till proven guilty, right? Our most fundamental category is us and them. I quote Rudyard Kipling. All good people agree and all good people say, all nice people like us are we and everyone else is they. Clearly, race is a basic division of us and them, and white people's historic stereotypes of black people are all some variant of less than human, to borrow from the title of David Livingston Smith's brilliant book. Smith, a New England philosopher, argues that dehumanization was created in order to allow violence to be used. Before you can kill someone, lock them up or enslave them, you have to dehumanize them. Native people were savages, so we were justified in exterminating the brutes. Slavery was justified because black people were closer to apes than human beings anyway. On a small scale, you see it on the streets among gang members. Crips and Bloods call rival gang members crabs or slobs, and vice lords and gangsters call their enemies donuts and Vicky Lou's. Rivals are not seen as people like them wearing different colors, but as something inanimate, weak, or non-human. In the Ahmaud Arbery hate crimes trial that has recently concluded, the perpetrators, the McMichaels and William Bryan, called black people like Arbery, and I quote from the transcript, brace yourself, animals, criminals, monkeys, and subhuman savages. That made killing Ahmaud easier, since he was in essence less than human anyway. Therefore, you're not killing a person, but an animal, maybe an evil. You might dismiss that as the words of diehard racists, but consider how words of dehumanization are used in our criminal justice system. In Gangs on Trial, I report how prosecutors called Jackie Montanez worse than Al Capone. Ike Easley had to be killed before he kills again, and Thomas Demetrius Smith was referred to at trial by a street named Mad Dog. If prosecutors are trying to put someone to death or lock them up for the rest of their life, it helps not to see them as human beings, but as something else, something wicked, something less than human. Craig Haney explains that the criminal justice system since the 70s has been steadily stripping away any context for crimes, and prosecutors increasingly describe crime as the product of evil people. Evil people do evil things, George Lakoff recaps his perspective. No further explanation is necessary. If I could return to criminology for a second, a common theory of street violence is frustration leads to aggression. Young black men with no hope for the future lash out, and their target is a scapegoat for their frustrations. Similarly, racist violence against George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery results from these black men being a substitute, a scapegoat for the intensity of racism by those police officers aimed at all black people. But isn't that what happens in court? The black or Latino gang member is the target for the frustrations of prosecutors who in many of my trials call out to the jury in emotional words, "The community is fed up with gang violence." Thus, the frustrations of the community, as represented by the prosecutors, lash out at the specific gang defendant who becomes a scapegoat for community frustration and anger. In this way, I argue, dehumanization is the psychological foundation of our mass incarceration society. This book is different than others that I've written. It's mainly about us, not them. It moves the study of gangs away from criminology into a different literature, social psychology, which I needed to help me explain what in the world was going on. These fantastic claims about gangs were not only made, but believed by juries and judges. And I had to figure out what's going on. And so I had to sort of leave the criminology literature and the other literatures I worked in and go into the rabbit hole of studies of social psychology. The recurring metaphor in the book is the myth of Sisyphus, the Greek king who was condemned by the gods to roll a giant boulder up a hill in Hades, only to have it roll back down before it reached the top, and he has to begin all over again for eternity. And that's the image, really, on that part of the book. Very cleverly, Temple came up with that. The point I take from Sisyphus is that the goal is not always to win the battle, but to keep on fighting. I give examples of how I combated stereotypes by reframing them in ways to make gang members' actions human, more understandable to judges and juries. It's not a book of great successes. It's really a book of frustration. Is that like Sisyphus, that hill of stereotypes is just too hard, and I felt the stone roll back down over me and the defendants time and time again. But that wasn't a reason to quit. You need to keep on fighting. And it's tough when victory. Randolph can testify to this. Victory for rather than a 40-year sentence might be a 30-year sentence for a kid who's 17, right? Or life without parole rather than a death penalty. But life without parole means death behind bars. That's what that means. And so the victories, I always felt were really hollow, hard fought, and, meaningful on one level. But just, you have to sort of realize that hill is still there. And, it's just, I'm not sure we're making progress, but that doesn't mean you don't fight. That was sort of the point of the book. Our sentences are too long anyway, the structural issues, and prisons are terrible places to live. We urgently need sentence and prison reform, but that too is an uphill battle. In the meantime, we have to keep fighting. My hope is that Gangs on Trial will help check prosecutors' use of stereotypes and limit their dehumanizing rhetoric. I think my book will be welcomed by the movement for progressive prosecutors. I hope so. I hope it helps. We could quit now and go to questions, or I could tell you a story that didn't make the book. The story that I was saving because it was so good. But then when you get done writing, you realized, I came to the end, that I was done. And I didn't have a room for the story. So I figured, Mary told me, says, well, you can tell it when you do talks. So you want to hear a story? Okay. All right. This is after, when I was on the street corners doing research, you learn to write field notes, right? You write up, you have interactions, you go back and you write up what happened, how you make sense of it. Well, I did that with every court appearance, that I had every case. And so I have a whole long string of, I did 83 cases, right? So I wrote them all up. So I had all this material. And some of the times the descriptions of what happened were so clear in my field notes, I just reprinted them directly in the book rather than try to tell the story over. I just reprinted my field notes. But this is one that I didn't get a chance to print. It's entitled Not Gang Related, January 29, 2015. 215, wow. A week ago, I talked for 4 hours with Chris Foreman in DeKalb County Jail. Chris was jailed for murder, is on trial for his life under Georgia's gang terrorism statute. On the face of it, this is as gang-related as you get, fitting every scary stereotype of a gang member. After a robbery and brutal murder of a gay guy in a suburban Atlanta hotel, Chris signed a statement saying the murder was his initiation into the Beanie Brim Blood Gang. Detectives found it written a statement the day after the murder and was the basis for count 11 of the indictment, which carries the death penalty. If ever a case was gang-related, this was it. Or was it? My idea going into the case is Chris was at best a wannabe and naively signed this initiation statement. At first I thought the statement might have been written by police. I never heard of anything like it, and I contacted Alex Alonso, the leading blood expert in the country, and he hadn't heard of anything like a written statement initiation either. And then my notes go on to describe my adventures in DeKalb County Jail, which is a whole other story. I met with the legal team after I had met with Chris. I shocked them twice. First, I explained that Chris had talked for hours about his gang membership in the 9 Trey Bloods in North Carolina. He may have been exaggerating, but he was knowledgeable of blood oaths and laws and described in detail a fight with Mexicans where he wielded a baseball bat. This, he was told, was his initiation years ago. He also described in detail to me the blood organization in the jail and showed me the blood tattoo he got once he was in. The lawyer's theory of the case, and mine, that he was a naive wannabe, wouldn't work. Simply put, one reason the initiation didn't make sense was Chris was already a gang member. So that's hardly a mitigating circumstance in trial. But the second shock was greater. My wife, Mary, who's here today, there she is, called it a Lindley moment from the Elizabeth George novels where I solved the crime. This is a first for me. I told the lawyers there were 3 problems with the gang-related theme. First, of course, was that if Chris was a blood, he wouldn't need to be initiated. Secondly, the Atlanta Bainey Brim gang appeared to be more imaginary than real. Chris said that Darius Adderhold, the so-called leader, didn't appear to know any blood hand signs, how to fold the flag, or respond to key gang words. But the key issue, I said to a quiet and shocked legal team, was the missing 20 minutes. The original plan was for the robbery was to roll a gay guy in Midtown. Instead, Darius, the leader, had talked his way into this guy, Ross's car, and told Chris and his buddy John that the gay guy, Ross, would give them a ride back to Darius's apartment. When they got there, Darius told Chris and John to go to the store for 15 minutes or so, then come to the apartment. When they did, Darius was in black pajama bottoms and whispered they would rob the guy, Ross, after he got out of the bathroom. So I asked the lawyers, what happened in those 20 minutes? That Darius and Ross were alone. It's pretty obvious and explains the savagery of the beating given to Ross. His face looked like a pumpkin that was like all blown up and gashed and shattered. It's, a brutal beating. I'm glad I'm not doing PowerPoint because I have pictures and you wouldn't want to see them. Darius was not only reacting to his getting a blowjob for $20 or so, or whatever the price was, but also covering this up to John and Chris. Dead gay men tell no tales. After a stunned silence, the lawyers asked me if Chris had figured this out. And I said, as it became clear to me, I asked him pointed questions, and he said it was all falling in place. Well, I think Chris took part in the beating and is guilty of homicide. The brutality of the beating with a table leg was not done by him. He had no motive for that kind of brutality. But the beating was personal to Darius, the leader. I actually felt a little like Lindley, to tell the truth. But the key takeaway from this case is that gang-related is manufactured not only by law enforcement, but in this case by a gang member himself, to shift blame and confuse authorities. The end of the story is that Chris was appropriately convicted of a homophobic hate crime, not a gang crime, and was spared the death penalty. Let me stop here. Just urge you to read Gangs on Trial. It's filled with readable stories that explain the power of stereotypes and the limited ways we have to fight them in court. And it's short, 207 pages. Knock that off in a day or so, right? And the royalties go to a good cause, to the Georgia Research Center. I guess it's time for questions.
The great John Hagedorn. We will take questions now, and for those of you out in Cyberlandia, you can also put your Q&A into the questions, and I will be looking for those. And if any of you here have questions or comments, you can make them in either of the microphones, and John will field.
Would you want me up there?
No, you can sit here.
Okay.
Sit here. Okay, any comments or questions? This gentleman's going to ask a question. Hey, no? Comments, questions?
Congratulations, John. Fantastic book. I just wanted to elucidate 2 points that I think everyone might benefit by you elaborating on. One is how, as a witness, did you undertake strategically to challenge the stereotype? And how successful were you? And secondly, in terms of the prosecution side, could you talk a little bit about the kind of standardization of prosecution, gang arguments, how that information is propagated across the country? And related to that, could you talk about the quality of gang experts for the prosecution? So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the prosecution side and the quality of expert witness on the prosecution side. And secondly, which I think is very important, is you outline your strategy for undermining stereotypes.
I wish I could report a lot of successes, and success. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Is it, no, we
Okay.
need to, is it on?
Yeah.
Can you hear him?
I saw a thumbs up in the back. Success often, doesn't result in. I only had one story in the book of where somebody who was innocent, sort of the Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson kind of story where someone, it's unjust prosecution. It was Timothy Shank's prosecution in Minnesota. And I was really nervous about including it in the book because it's such an outlier. Is that unlike Brian was uncovering innocence, what I was uncovering in my work was that the prosecution was based on stereotypes and dehumanizing rather than on the evidence. The evidence really was secondary. They're looking at these evil people and that of course evil people do evil things. And they didn't bother to look for the evidence. And I don't think, I almost always came away from cases frustrated. Randolph and Michael Cook's and Cantrell's case, which I write up in the book. I just was very frustrated at the end that I just didn't think that it played much of a role in what the sentence. They gave them the maximum. So what did I do? So it's not about being successful, is what I learned. That was the hardest lesson. It's about fighting, and that you got to keep that fight up if you're ever going to win. And even if you don't win, that was the essence of what I learned from why Sisyphus is on the cover of the book, is that you have to keep fighting. I did learn some methods of reframing, in at least one case, in Cantrell Stoutenmar's case, I looked at, the issue was whether he had left the gang or not. And of course, the prosecutors said, well, he couldn't have left the gang because he wasn't beaten out, and it just went through this whole thing. It wasn't a bloody, the hospital would have known, on and on. And so, I said to the judge, well, and Mary was there at that at that court hearing as well, and I said, I said to the judge, it's like leaving the gang is sort of like leaving the church, is that you don't just walk up to the priest and say, I'm sorry, I'm quitting today, right? For one thing, her parents would have probably beaten the crap out of her. You don't do it like that. You just start, instead of going every week, you skip a week, you slow down, and then it's Easter and Christmas only, and then somehow we became Unitarians, right? But that Catholic stuff is still there with her as well, right? She's once a Catholic, always a Catholic, right? In some sense, there you go. Look at that. The Pope will be proud of you. And leaving the gang, I said to the judge, that's the way it usually happens, not this spectacular stereotype manner. So I learned from that as Lakoff pointed out, facts are important, but frames are more important, right? So the framing of what's happening into something that's familiar and something that audience can understand and can look at that gang member, and that instead of seeing this as something exotic, oh my gosh, and you got to be beaten and the inch of your life to get out. It's sort of like the church. You're leaving the church. This is something you can identify with. You humanize the defendant, and that's the point of reframing, is that the judge and jury can look at this murderous gang member here and just see a young woman in a mask at a talk, just a real person, So that's the trick, and does it work? Not often. But that's sort of the way I approached it. The standardization question, I use a manual. Prosecutors have a gang prosecution manual, and it's amazing to read. They really talk about the importance of gangs and always bringing in gang stuff, and what's important, the juicy stuff, that they're really looking at playing on the ingrained stereotypes that are there. Because the stereotypes make their case, they don't need the evidence. So that's the standard approach of prosecutors. They rely on the story, and the story that they tell. I told defense attorneys at a conference in Florida, the conference is all about telling stories. And they were talking about how you have to tell stories, and all that's true. But I pointed out to them that the prosecutor's stories are better than theirs, because the prosecutor's stories are all a variant of the Big Bad Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood, right? Or the Three Little Piggies. And what happens to the Big Bad Wolf in the story? Well, he gets dropped in a boiling pot of water. And, when we were little kids, we all just laughed and giggled that he got his just desserts, right? That's the story that they evoke. And what's the story you have? The Big Bad Wolf is a good guy? It's a huge problem in storytelling, because the prosecutors have that power of culture going on their side.
How about the experts, police experts?
The what?
Police expert witnesses?
Oh! Yeah, I've got a bunch of those. One of the things I don't think I mentioned in the talk, this followers of our Lord King Satan, that's embedded in police training manuals. And it's throughout the South. I don't know if it's broader, but in trials that I've gone to, police experts routinely come out and say, folks, stands for followers of our Lord King Satan, like that's fact, right? So this is the kind of stereotypes that they play on, and demonization. And why do they do it? Because it works. It absolutely works. Juries, when we do jury questionnaires afterwards, just talk about being frightened of the stories about gangs. There was one that was in Milledgeville with Butts and Wilson, where the jury said that they didn't realize there was a gang crime wave, and it scared the hell out of them. Of course, there was no gang crime wave, and part of my testimony was looking at numbers and showed that homicide and assaults had declined since the gangs had been there. But to the prosecutor, there was a gang crime wave, and they had to stop it. So that kind of scare tactics are used, and they're used because they work, and they're not contested. Defense attorneys often don't know how to deal with it, which of course is one reason why I wrote the book.
Well, take your question, and then I've got a question also from the Zoom. Oh, sorry, go ahead, sir.
Sorry, this microphone's almost in the parking lot, but thank you for making it only have 3 things that you have to remember. I wish the rest of life was like that. I could handle that part. My experience with gangs is both dated and anecdotal. It was from the Audi Home and Pilsen gangs 20 or 30 years ago, and kind of stopped when the city of Chicago decided that if they had midnight basketball leagues, that was going to solve all the problems. And I remember at the time thinking that what gangs are providing for the individuals is much higher on Maslow's hierarchies than just something to do and keep busy on a summer night. You've explained a number of the things about how the society is dealing with gangs as stereotypes or something. But I wondered, what is your opinion, or have you done any research on why kids get into it? And do you consider that like something that should be redirected or needs to be redirected? Thank you.
Yeah. In court, the process of gang formation, of why people are in gangs, is unproblematic. It's because they're evil people, and that they're attempting to inflict harm on the community. And the notion that a gang, like the literature goes back to Thrasher, the notion that a gang is something that's sort of natural in a neighborhood and can take all sorts of forms. I wrote a book about it, A World of Gangs. I looked at the variety of forms of armed young men around the world, and this is a natural thing. And part of what you have to argue in court is to understand that. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that that prosecutors routinely strike any black jurors from the jury, because they may have had some personal experience. They may know somebody next door, and their view of them is not that they're evil, it's the kid next door, had some problems, they can have some empathy because they have experience. So routinely black jurors, they can't be stricken, they have to be stricken for cause, but they come up with some cause to get rid of black jurors. And not because they say that black jurors may be afraid. They often say, we don't want black jurors because they might be threatened by the gang. That isn't what it is. It's that they may know that gang members as human beings, and that all of this demonization and stuff won't work. So we've seen that in trial after trial where black jurors are struck because they know too much. They know that gang member as when he's a little kid, and he's, my gosh, you're not different from my little kid. So that's the process of what's going on with juries.
Let me take a question here from our cyber audience. Dr. this is from Edith Rivera.
Okay.
Dr. Hagedorn, many of our justice-involved youth for UUW, gun possession offenses, have been stigmatized as gang-involved youth. We have seen an uptick in gun violence during the pandemic landscape, but many of our Chicago youth on the south and west sides who are filtered into the system for gun possession are victims and labeled as gang members. I'm hoping in my research we can provide more context to the lived experience of Chicagoland youth who are petitioned to juvenile court but also influenced by the stereotypical archetypes that you write about that were at one time traumatized children. I'm hoping your scholarship will shift structural racist practices and policies that impact justice-involved youth.
Well, I'm glad you said structural. I mean, that one of the arguments that I make in Gangs on Trial is that I chose as my work to go into courts and to wage this battle, and that's a small part of the struggle. The larger struggle is in the streets, that's how change occurs. Brown versus the Board of Education didn't happen because those lawyers were so smart, but that the world was looking at the U.S. and that there was a sort of worldwide condemnation of racism in the United States. And so Brown was one of the reasons Brown was decided at that point. But you've got one of the things, and it's a problem with anybody, I guess, is that you think that the stuff that you're doing is having a big effect. But in reality, it's just a little pebble in the pond here. And what I concluded in Gangs on Trial is that I use that old song about all God's creatures got a place in the choir. Is that the point is you look for some place, some way to continue the struggle against injustice, but you realize that it's just much bigger. It's not it's not something that's going to be easily won. And that for instance, I tell a story at the end of a guy I called Francisco, and we made this compelling case, and it's one of the cases where the judge, was just engaged with me about, he wanted to know why preteens would be involved with gangs. And this was a homicide case, a young kid, he was 13 or 14, and the judge was really engaged talking with me about it, and I explained the process of being in a gang and what the gang did for him and all that. And the defense attorneys were really excited because I clearly had got through, but the sentencing guidelines didn't give the judge any leeway, or it did but he would have really taken crap from violating it. And so he gives this kid, this 15-year-old kid, he gives him 32 years. And the defense attorneys congratulated me, said the betting pool was 39 to 40 years. That's so. Even if we had more experts and we fought better in court, whatever, as long as the sentencing guidelines are such and that the long sentences that happen here, the effect is going to be limited. So it's a broader struggle that has to take place. And, so the stories I tell in my book are not only the stories in the courtroom, but they're stories from my life as an activist, because I do think that that's the way that change is going to be most affected. And so as Mary knows, sometimes you have to go to jail. That's the way it is. So it's a broad struggle.
Last question, then we have a program after this we're going to say a few words about Dr. Hagedorn and his work. Go ahead.
So I wonder if you define success too narrowly. For some people, moving off death row into general population, serving life without parole, that's success. For other people, rather than serving life without parole, but serving 40 years and getting out at 50, that's a major success. And for some people, for some clients, just the idea that people are standing up for them and fighting for them in court, as you do, that's a major success, regardless of the actual outcome. So I'm just wondering whether your definition of success is too narrow.
Well, sort of yes and no. I understand that. I mean, certainly the people facing the death penalty, this is an intense fight to get life without parole. And 10 years is 10 years, and it's certainly appreciated then. But the reality of the reason I'm a bit skeptical is that the system is so regressive and so anti-human that, 30 years in Stateville, what is that going to do to you? This is not a, those are terrible places to live, right? And people have to become somebody else when they're there because they have to. So victory, and I'm not saying that people should, I'm not a defense lawyer, and I don't believe people should get away with murder. On the other hand, I think sentences are way too long. Norway, the absolute limit for a sentence is 21 years. Can you guys think back 21 years ago and what you would have missed in 21 years? That's a horrible penalty. And yeah, if you killed somebody, the notion of eye for an eye, but haven't we got beyond that? Don't we understand that people can change? If you've been working with people in prisons, for as long as I have, you've seen the remarkable changes. We were at the pardon board, last week. With William Fletcher, who has served many a time in prison, and the board was struck by the good work that Sonny has done in North Lawndale for decades. And we're really hopeful that the governor is actually going to issue a pardon against all odds. We'll see, I'll let everybody know here. Sonny will let me know right away. But it was a fight worth fighting. And the Northwestern lawyers, Steve Drizzen and his team did a really good job. And it's sort of a story that fits into the notion of stereotypes, because we went there. I talked to Kathy, Sonny's wife, on the phone, and I said I was ready to do battle. Is that we were ready for this hostile panel that was going to come down and just ask all these hard questions and be skeptical and whatever. And what we got was the chair of the panel, the only woman and the only African-American woman on the panel, at one point cut one of the witnesses off and said, we don't need to hear anymore. We know all about Sonny Fletcher. I'm from North Lawndale, and I know all about his good works. Whoa! Right? Our stereotypes of that panel were shattered at that point, right? But you watch people, and it's when I spoke, I talked about the amazing transformation of Sonny Fletcher. But the death penalty and these long sentences just cut off the humanity of people and don't allow them to change, don't allow them to do the kind of things that Sonny's been doing for decades in North Lawndale. So in that sense, I understand the argument, but I get very depressed because of those long periods of time that people are going to spend in prison. And that's the final chapter of the book is called Humanizing Justice. We have to look at these people not as a monster, not as cold-blooded killers, whatever, but as human beings like us. And if you do that, then why would you lock a human being in a small little cage, right? It's just have you all ever been to Stateville? This is not a place where you want anyone that you love to be. So that's why it's much more of the overall the overall doom that the carceral state, that's mass incarceration society. And, I really learned it in writing this book and reading Less Than Human and Craig Haney's work, that I realized that the necessary psychological phenomena was to dehumanize these people, to treat gang members as a different category. Black people are different than normal humans, right? As long as you can categorize them and say they're different, then you don't have to treat them well, right? It's they, and so you have permission to lock them up, to kill them. And so that's why the thread of the argument of the book is that dehumanization is what drives the mass incarceration society.
Let me read this statement from one of our participants on Zoom. I am a practicing attorney here in Wisconsin. The system is corrupt and does not care about either defendants or their attorneys. The corrupt nature of cops lying is condoned by judges who know cops lie. Prosecutors know it too. It is all very degrading.
Well, corrupt, yeah. On the other hand, it's working as it's intended to work. There was a term, Craig Haney's work of looking at the history of the criminal justice system. They made a conscious turn in the 70s, to strip away context. I had a trial. I can't, since it's not done. I did one since I retired in Milwaukee. a murder trial, and I wrote this report explaining what had happened. And one of the things that was driving them was that after this guy shot the victim, he walked over to him and emptied his gun into him. And they said, that's a sign of a monster. And I said, no, that's a common psychological phenomena called forward panic. Is that people are so charged, and in war, and the studies about forward panic are in war, with good red-blooded American and European soldiers who in World War I would charge over the trench and stab the first person and then keep stabbing people, including medics and wounded and whatever, because they were so filled with emotion, forward panic, and it's a common phenomena. Michael Cooks couldn't understand why he shot the second guy, right? And I try to explain that to him. So the issue in court is not so much that it's not so much that it's corrupt and people, and you have a lot of that. But I really found, first of all, I found variation among prosecutors. Not all of them were just going after, some of them stopped and we talked and we ended up negotiating, or the lawyers ended up negotiating a plea. And that prosecutors, I often say, are just like gang members. There are many different types. And police officers, right? There's not just one kind. So it's important to look at the system as certainly as that there's boundaries of how far you can go, but there's human players in the system. And if you treat them all as whatever, demonized prosecutors or police officers, you never get anywhere. I tell a whole bunch of wild stories about my demonizing of people and how that didn't work. So I think the problem of the system is that it's working as it's supposed to work, not that it's corrupt. Clearly I've got a couple things about how prosecutors will suborn witnesses when their case isn't strong enough. They will hire somebody to snitch and make up stories. And, I've gone after those in court and they tell a bunch of stories. But most of the time they don't need to because the stereotypes are good enough.
Last question, and then we're going to go to this next part of our program.
I was just curious. Do you have like a fear that in your ideal world with lesser sentences and like no death sentences, that wouldn't be enough of a deterrence for criminals? Like if mass incarceration now is as bad as it is, and if consequences are as bad as they are, theoretically, if prison was just like a rehabilitation and it was easier, wouldn't criminals be more inclined to offend due to less fear of consequences?
One of the things is we've got to sort of realize that criminals are not just one thing, and crime is all sorts of different issues. Most homicide, for example, deterrence plays almost nothing because it's crimes of passion. People get carried away and their anger is there, and they kill. They don't stop and think before they do it. Oh my gosh, I'm going to get 30 years and not 20. It doesn't much matter. So the issue of long sentences, I'm not sure I'm not sure how it weighs in on many of the crimes that we're most concerned with, the violence. We do need to look around the world. Nobody has sentences as long as the United States, and just about the whole world has crime rates lower than the United States. Now, what comes to mind here when you see that, right? So I think just on the grounds of humanity, we need to look at the people that we're prosecuting who have done terrible things. The people I have worked for have committed some just terrible crimes, things that, Ike Easley who killed a correctional official in the jail after his buddy was killed. When I interviewed him, it was this really intense interview, and I said, walk me through what happened. And he said, I can't believe you asked me that. And so he walked through it, and he said, when I got done, I threw up like a motherfucker. And, the animals don't throw up after they kill. Monsters don't do it. Hitmen don't do it, right? But people like you and me, when they commit acts of violence, it has tremendous repercussions inside, right? So we need to recognize that humanity, and that's the trick of prosecutors, is that you can't think of Ike Easley as throwing up. What you think about is what they said is, you have to kill him before he kills again, right? So I think the way to approach this is by humanizing justice. We have to look at the people who have done wrong and done harm, serious harm, as humans. And if we treat them as humans, not as something else, as mad dogs, then I think it doesn't make sense to have these terrible sentences or the death penalty.
Thank you.
Wow, that's a really very deep and very significant statement, John, and message of your work. And probably a good moment to segue into the next phase of our program here. So let me introduce Professor Follman, who's from the professor who does great work of her own. She is a professor in criminology, law, and justice, and she's going to read a statement from Professor Beth Ritchie, who couldn't be here today, and then she's going to then introduce a number of speakers who are going to give testimony to you, John.
Testimony,
He didn't. Well, maybe we shouldn't talk. Maybe I shouldn't call it testimony, right? Testament, a tribute. How about that, Professor?
So, as was said, my name is Lisa Froman, and I'm here on behalf of the Department of Criminology and Law and Justice. And I guess I must just say, John, it's so wonderful to be in your presence again, to hear the fight, to hear the persistence, and remember how important that was for us to hear. During all the times in faculty meetings, you really tried to push us in the direction, I must say, we are there now. And I'm sorry you're not there on an everyday basis to see where we've come. So Beth Ritchie, who is our department chair, is ill today, and she'd asked me to read you a statement. She says, "Dear John, I'm so sorry that due to illness, I cannot be present in person to celebrate your new book. I had hoped that I would feel well enough to attend today, but alas, the flu has prevailed. Others are here to talk about your contribution to the discipline. My strong desire to attend was, of course, to hear you talk about your book that I know you have been working on for such a long time. But also, perhaps more importantly, I want to be here to appreciate your work as a faculty member in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice over the years, where you have served as an esteemed member of our faculty. If I were here in person, I would describe in great length the things you did to make us strong and the program very vibrant. The exciting courses you taught, the students you mentored with such dedication, many of whom are here today in your honor, the provocative challenges you brought to our faculty deliberations, and the communities you brought into our community and consciousness. Thank you for all you did, sometimes against considerable pushback, to help us be an academically rigorous, politically accountable, and more transparent academic community. We did not always, quote, do it right, but to the extent that we did, it was in great part because of you. Finally, John, I want you to know from where I sit now, as department head, many of the things you advocated for, the radical visions of the academy, an emphasis on critical criminology, and a more transgressive curriculum, much of what you argued for have grown since you left. We have changed in profound ways, and your influence is still felt in the hallways, classrooms, and committee meetings. I want to sincerely thank you and honor the foundation that you have set for what we are becoming. On a very personal note, I appreciate your contributions to me personally and our department collectively. Congratulations and thank you. We have, as was mentioned, a number of speakers, and I'm going to give some brief bios and introduce them. I think many people in the audience may not be familiar with them. The first is Dr. Elijah Anderson. He's a Sterling Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Yale University, and as John has mentioned, one of the leading urban ethnographers in the United States. He's published numerous books: Code of the Street, Decency, Violence, and Moral Life of the Inner City, Streetwise, Race, Class, and Change in the Urban Community, and a classic work, A Place on the Corner. Again, as you mentioned, John, his most recent work, Black and White Spaces, The Enduring Impact of Color in the Everyday Life, will be published by Chicago Press in 2022. Many of these books have won awards from the Eastern Sociological Association and the American Sociological Association as well. Additionally, Professor Anderson has won numerous awards from the American Sociological Association, most recently the W.E. Du Bois Career Distinguished Scholar Award and the Robert and Helen Lind Award for Lifetime Achievement. And most recently, in 2021, he was the recipient of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. And he should appear on the screen at any moment.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here in honor of John. John is, it's hard to follow John and all the things that have been said. But I do want to say it is a pleasure to be here. And John, I really appreciate John for his ability to sort of speak off the cuff. He's a great raconteur, tells wonderful stories. And John and I go back a long way, back to the late 1980s when he published his book, People and Folks. John, along with William Julius Wilson and myself and others, were beginning to see the change in the economy from manufacturing to service and high technology in the context of an increasingly globalized economy. But this impacted the neighborhoods in a peculiar way. Jobs disappeared. Jobs disappeared. And a lot of the street gangs began to become economic gangs. They began to sell drugs and that kind of thing. And this was a very important development, and we paid attention to this. And John noted this in his book. And this set the stage for a more critical and structural analysis of poverty, but also the gang violence that was going on at the time. And I just want to take my hat off to John and say I really appreciate his work over the years. I appreciate his new book. I appreciate the fact that he's really bringing these issues to light. And I just want to say on his career, well done, well done. And thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Oh, yeah.
Our next speaker is Dr. Meta Chesney Lynn. She's working very early. She's in Hawaii. She is an emerita in women's studies at the University of Hawaii. She is also nationally recognized for her work in women and crime. In 2013, the Western Society of Criminology named an award after her, honoring, quote, the significant contributions to the fields of gender, crime, and justice. And she was the inaugural recipient. She's also the past president of the American Society of Criminology, and she and John together edited the book, Female Gangs in America, Essays on Girls, Gangs, and Gender.
Aloha. Can everyone hear me? This is the first question you have to ask. Is it all good?
Yep.
Lovely. Well, thank you again for allowing me to join you in this wonderful celebration of John's work. When people and folks hit the streets in criminology, it shattered the gang literature that had existed before it. William Julius Wilson called it the most insightful book ever written on inner city gangs, and I couldn't agree more. It's returning the gang research to its core, the work of Clifford Shaw, and again, a shout out to Chicago here, and leaving the kind of quantitative criminology that had begun to characterize gang research. John, think of the great database, if you will, and all the many surveys of gang youth. It was shattered by John's work. And what was especially important, it was mentioned in Professor Anderson's remarks, but I'll just, looking at the impact of the economy on gang formation, John also focused on the role of race in gang desistance, noting that the few jobs that did continue to exist went to white gang members. So those boys left the gang, whereas the African-American youth were left with only the gang as a way to survive economically. John and I connected, as was mentioned earlier, around the issue of female gangs in America, and we wrote a book on that topic because we realized girls were present in all of the gang situations, but no one was talking about them, or they were talking about them in very stereotypical ways. John's done a wonderful job, and he talked about it with passion today, of challenging the racist tropes and stereotypes that have existed around the demonization, really, of gang youth, and trying instead to speak to them, to talk about their stories and their situations. And he's done it in powerful ways in all of the work that he's done. And I expect to look forward to read the current book where now he's talking about the work that he's done. And I shout out to you, John, because it's tough to do the work you do, and where the victory is 32 years, not 40. That's tough. I heard that and I winced at it. And you've done it 83 times. So congratulations on your new book. I can't wait to read it. And again, you deserve all the honors that you've received here today. So congratulations and aloha again to everybody. Thank you for including me.
Our next speaker, many of you may be familiar with, Dr. Dick Simpson. He has a uniquely combined a distinguished academic career with public service in the government. He's widely published. He's been an outstanding teacher and effective public policy. He began his academic career at UIC in '67, where he has taught for more than 50 years. So that's an amazing accomplishment. At UIC, he's received the highest awards given for teaching, such as the Silver Circle, twice, the UIC Award for Excellence in Teaching, and also the American Political Science Association and the Pi Sigma Alpha National Award for Outstanding Teaching in Political Science. He's also a former department head. He's been a principal researcher on important studies, which have led to many reforms in many areas of the government in Chicago, Cook County, and Illinois, and he's worked together with John on those. He's co-authored or authored a number of books: Rogues, Rebels, and the Rubber Stamp, The City Revisited, African Development and Democracy, Corrupt Illinois, Winning Elections in the 21st Century, and I'm going to go to his most recent book, Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Discipline. He's also produced 8 films and video documentaries, winning a variety of awards, including an Emmy nomination. And he has served in Chicago government, where he was an assembly person from 1971 to 1979.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here, and a particular pleasure to be in John's presence again. John wasn't just within criminal justice department at UIC. He's of course at great cities, but he worked with us in political science as well. In political science, he helped us understand the role of police abuse and the problems that came with police corruption, eventually leading to a chapter in our book, Corrupt Illinois. John is a public intellectual. That is, his work, his hard work over so many decades is helping to transform our understanding of the criminal justice system, of gangs, of the race policies in the United States, and they are leading to reforms. John, they may not come easily, but you're more than a pebble in the pond. You're more like a boulder.
Both are rocks, however.
Our next speaker, we're now going to have our live speakers, is Dr. Lance Williams. He's a professor of urban community studies at the historic Jacob H. Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies at Northeastern Illinois University. Lance met John in the early 2000s as a doctoral student in the School of Public Health at UIC. He mentored John through the completion of his PhD. John mentored him. Let's start that over. No, I don't mean that part. John mentored Lance through the completion of his PhD in 2004 and have remained colleagues and friends since. Lance currently works in Activists Incorporated, Chicago Cred, and other Chicago area violence prevention groups that serve young men who are at risk for being shooting perpetrators or victims. For over 20 years, Lance has worked as an expert witness in federal and local gang and violence-related cases. He's the author of Culture and Perceptions of Violence-Related Behaviors Among Adolescents, a co-author of Almighty Black Keystone Nation, The Fall, Rise, and Resurgence of the American Gang with Madeline Moore, and author of a forthcoming book, King David and Boss Daly. And we also have an unexpected but welcome appearance by Dr. Chico Tillman, one of our graduates.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chico and I are going to share time. So just in a couple, I want to just say, as Lisa mentioned, I met John back in the early 2000s as a grad student, doctoral student here on campus. And so my work, my interest in research as a student revolved around street gangs. And my father is one of the original members of the Vice Lords, who John did a lot of research on and studied, and had a relationship with a lot of the original Vice Lords. And so I always say, I was raised by the streets, but not in the streets. So all of the guys that I grew up around as older men in my neighborhood were affiliated with various street organizations, but particularly the Vice Lords. And my father, being a kid from North Lawndale, was one of those guys. And he always, I saw him as a man who was concerned about his community, his family. He loved his family. His my mother and father married for 50 plus years. And all of the men that were in his circle were, although they were affiliated with a street organization, which I never knew as a kid, they were just men in the neighborhood. And I didn't find out until I was much older that they were members of a street organization. And it wasn't until I began to understand this from a professional perspective, who they were. But it was John's work when I was here on campus that really cast my father and his friends in a way that I saw him growing up, not the stereotypical, criminals, right? And so that's what attracted me to him, and got a chance to meet with him, and he mentored me through my work, and then we've remained friends through over the years. He's actually got me started following in his footsteps, doing an expert witness testimony kind of work. So I really appreciate it. I love it. I'm really passionate about it, and kind of just trying to, continue his legacy in that space. And so at this time, I want to bring on my brother, too, who also traveled the same path somewhat as myself, Dr. Chico Tillman, who is one of John's students. And Chico now is one of the executive directors over at Heartland Alliance, which is a major organization doing a lot of great work in the community. So I'm going to bring up Chico now. Yes, sir.
First of all, I apologize how I'm dressed. When Lance called me and told me Dr. Hagedorn wanted me to come, I just jumped up and came all the way from Linwood and jumped in my car. And that's just how much he means to me. Just to give you some context and the authenticity of his book, I'm an individual that was a gang member from the west side of Chicago, was system impacted, served 16 years and 3 months in federal prison under a draconian crack sentence for really being involved in gangs and refusing to testify on individuals I grew up in the community. So I actually did 16 years and 3 months in prison. First, Lance was my mentor, and as I matriculated through Northeastern, he said, I gotta introduce you to Dr. Hagedorn. And I remember first meeting him prior to even applying, and I said, I wanna get my PhD. And he looked at me, he said, why do you wanna get a PhD? I said, and I told him, I wanna better understand myself. I say, my research, I wanna understand why me and my friends did some of the things we did. And I'm gonna tell you, my honesty allowed him to gravitate toward me and mentor me in a way that a father does a son. And I'm appreciative and a resemblance of what change and behavior modification looks like, and how he was able to humanize me despite my past. And now I stand on the precipice of becoming one of the individuals that helped write the bill for the ARPA money that the whole nation got and helped raise $2.1 billion for Black and brown people all over the country, and was invited to the White House. But none of this happened had nobody saw something in me, to be honest, that I really didn't see in myself at first. He told me in the beginning that it was gonna be hard. He warned me about the challenges in classes, but he said I could do it. He told me if I could do the things and survive the things I had survived in the street, then I should be able to survive the things at a university. And I'm a testament to all the work he's put in, not only in North Lawndale, but throughout the United States, which opened a doorway for individuals who've made mistakes in their life to have a transition and opportunity in mainstream society. So I'm forever thankful for you for believing in me when few people did. So not only as I look to you as a friend, but like a big brother. And anytime you call me, I'm dropping everything and coming. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Just as Lance was one of your early students and Chico was kind of in the middle, I'd now like to introduce soon-to-be Dr. Caitlin Devaney. She's finishing her PhD here at UIC in Department of Criminology and Justice, and she's scheduled to defend her dissertation next month. I guess it's an open event. Her dissertation is titled Death by Abandonment, Understanding North Lawndale's Historical High Homicide Rate. Her work integrates critical race theory and racial formation theory to contextualize neighborhood homicide rates in Chicago communities. She has picked up, and actually so is Nixon, and is now teaching the course you initiated, Gangs in the Media, to our undergraduates here. And John has been not only her chair, but her mentor since she's arrived at UIC. So.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I thought a good way to end today was to talk, when we talk about what Dr. Hagedorn has contributed to the field, it's so important to talk about his advising and his mentorship. And I know Chico talked a little bit about it, But it's something that I haven't really experienced in my life, and it's something that has gotten me to where I am now. So as opposed to what Chico was saying, I came into the university in a position that academia loves. I came from a really prestigious college. I walked right in the door. I was having people say, hey, continue on to a PhD. Where I struggled is I didn't understand what it all meant. I didn't understand what it meant to sit in a classroom and talk to one another about ideas that nobody took up outside of academia. And I struggled with that concept. And then I met Dr. Hagedorn. And Dr. Hagedorn, when you talk about his mentorship, you talk about, just like what Chico said, he takes you on like one of his kids, to a point where I know Mary has said before, like, relax a little bit. You know, my problems became Dr. Hagedorn's problems. And I mean, one story is my sister in Milwaukee, she was a principal, and she was having a hard time with the Milwaukee Police Department coming to her grammar school and trying to take kids out of class. So she's frantic and she doesn't know how to deal with it. So she calls me thinking that I have something and I don't know, right? So I call Dr. Hagedorn, and within minutes, he's on the phone with my sister as she's separated from the rest of her school. And he's walking her through what to do. Somebody he's never met before. And to this day, my family calls him my academic angel, because I am here, I understand how academia moves to the streets. I understand now how it's not just sitting in the ivory tower. It is applicable to real life events, and that's why I've gotten my PhD, and that's why I'm here. So the last thing I'm gonna say is the comment that sticks with me from somebody when I presented my research and my proposal. The last comment was, I can see Dr. Hagedorn all through your research, and I've never been so proud. So thank you, Dr. Hagedorn.
Wow, so I'm like about to cry. This is the mentor and advisor we all wish we had, whether or not we got our degree here. So I just want to say thank you, John. Thank you for all your work, your persistence, your organizing, and your fight to never give up and try to help people in their everyday lives. And I have a card for you from all of us. You don't need to read it.
Okay.
But I just want to say thank you for being in our community, for teaching us all how to be fighters, engaged scholars, and activists. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Froman. Thank you, Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. Thank you for the wonderful testimonies, both from Zoom and from Lance and Chico and you, Caitlin. Very excited for your next step, and it was such a beautiful tribute. And thank you so much to all of you for being here. We really appreciate it. Most of all, thank you, John, for being you.
Well, thank you all.